Welcome back to Ralph Waldo Emerson, and this is a lecture on the American Scholar, an address that Emerson delivered at Harvard in 1837 to the Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society. And this is a really kind of famous talk that Emerson gave that is considered to be, or has been called, his Declaration of Independence, his intellectual America's Intellectual Declaration of Independence. And we'll see why. This is a talk in which Emerson is really claiming certain ways in which American scholars or thinkers in America can distinguish themselves from European thinkers. And we'll talk about exactly what he means by that. But just to be clear, this lecture was not originally called The American Scholar itself, the lecture itself. This was part of a series delivered at Harvard every year. There's a famous lecture given every year entitled with the theme of The American Scholar, and the invited speakers were to speak on that theme. So Emerson was invited to deliver this address in 1837, and his address became so famous that it became known as the American Scholar on its own lecture. So that's what this is. I just want to say a few things about the form of this essay before we get started with the content. Earlier, when we were discussing the sermons and the Divinity School address, we began to talk about homiletic structure, the structure of sermons, the structures of preacherly sermons in the Puritan and then later Unitarian tradition. And so we begin with a scriptural epigraph. We begin with a scriptural epigraph in the sermons. Emerson will begin now to, not quite yet in this lecture, but he'll begin to use poetic epigraphs. He'll begin to use poetry that he's written himself as an epigraph. He'll quote poetry from others. In this address specifically, he does not, but watch for that. So instead of a quotation from Scripture, he'll begin with a quotation from poetry of some kind, his own or that of someone else's. And then also he will sort of ruminate on a theme here, right? So the theme here is the American Scholar and what that means, what that is. So he's been given this topic, of course, but he'll spend some time opening his lecture here, sort of thinking about that topic and trying to make sense of it. Then moving on to kind of define his terms, clarify or try to clarify what he means. And then close with something like an application section. That is to say, a section in which he says, okay, so now what do we do with this, right? And how do we live a life? How does the person who's just listened to this talk or read this essay make good on or do something with what I've just said? So he begins, if you want to just look briefly, he turns on page 63, right after the full break between the paragraphs there on page 63. That's where he explicitly turns to what might be called the application section of his lecture that follows a kind of homiletic structure. So he says, I have now spoken of the education of the scholar by nature, by books, and by action. These are three important categories in the talk that we'll review. It remains to say somewhat of his duties, right? So he's thinking about what the scholar is and how the scholar learns in a certain way. Now, what is a scholar supposed to do? What are his duties? How do we apply this to what he's supposed to do? If we move on a bit further to page 66, you'll see Emerson become even more concrete about these duties. And he will say in the beginning of the middle of page 66 in the short 3-line paragraph, but I have dwelt perhaps tediously enough upon this abstraction of the scholar, that is to say, thinking about what the scholar is and so on, and what, in theory, his duties should be, right? Now he gets more concrete. I ought not to delay longer to add what I have to say of nearer reference to the time and to this country. So now he's going to talk specifically about what this American scholar should do in this time, 1837, and in this country, in America. All right, so the end of the application section closes with a discussion of how the American scholar should proceed here. And again, remember to distinguish him or herself from a European scholar. So if we begin, let's go back to the opening of the essay, and or talk rather, and we'll get started. A couple of things first. I'll sort of lay out where we're going. I want to say a couple of things about how this lecture is often taken. That is to say, what the primary claims or sort of urgings of this essay are often taken to be. And before we go on to actually work through it more carefully. So this essay is this sermon is kind of known for, if you look to page 59, the last paragraph. This essay is known for a couple of lines. I mean, there are a number of wonderful lines in this essay that people quote frequently, but there's this idea on page 59, the last paragraph, that I'm going to discuss, this idea of books being used only to inspire. That's one of the sort of most important for many people points to be taken from this essay. I want to say that that's a very important point, but there's more to it than that. So if we look to this, just to read briefly at the bottom of page 59, books are the best of things well used, abused among the worst. What is the right use? What is the right use of books? What is the one end which all men go to effect? They are for nothing but to inspire. All right, so books are only for inspiration. I had better never see a book than to be warped by its attraction to clear out of my own orbit and made a satellite instead of a system. That's a great sentence, isn't it? Wiped out of your own orbit, right, into someone else's orbit, out of your own system, becoming a satellite instead of a system. The one thing in the world of value is the active soul. Now, that is absolutely central to this essay, the active soul. Emerson is trying to talk in this essay about what it means to be an active soul, an active thinker, if you remember that he talks about or uses the terms soul and mind often quite synonymously. So we want to be an active soul. Now, here he claims, or seems to claim, or is said to have claimed only that books are used to inspire, that the active soul goes in and just finds what it wants and moves on. Well, the active soul actually, and this is what I'm going to kind of walk you through in this lecture, I think, or I would argue, is a participant in these two moves of thinking. And this goes back to Emerson's original what we've seen in all of his sermons and his lectures so far, this taking in and putting back out. So an active soul doesn't just spew, say what it likes, always express, always be involved in the output, right? But the active soul takes in, right? Processes, takes in, receives, as Emerson says, and then puts out, sort of acts or expresses, or takes part in action, and there's the action again. So an active soul is not simply always running around speaking, it's also taking part in the sort of sitting down and absorbing and receiving part of what it means to learn something and to know something. So we're going to go back through the essay and look at how that comes to be. So in the beginning, I keep saying essay, and you know that I mean lecture, so excuse me if I keep saying that. So let's go back to the beginning, just a couple of things in the beginning of the lecture, in which Emerson addresses, there are wonderful lines, really famous opening lines, addresses his audience and is disappointed, right? We're not surprised to see Emerson disappointed with his audience, right? So now we have students at Harvard and alumni from Harvard, not necessarily divinity school students, just general student population, honor society, so on. And he says, he greets, I'm not going to read all of this, but he says at about, referring to his holiday, the celebration of this American scholar, this idea of an American thinker, about 5 or 6 lines down on page 56. Thus far, our holiday has been simply a friendly sign of the survival of the love of letters amongst a people too busy to give to letters anymore. As such, it is precious as the sign of an indestructible instinct. Perhaps the time has already come when it ought to be and will be something else, when the sluggish intellect of this continent will look from under its iron lids and fill the postponed expectation of the world with something better than the exertions of mechanical skill. Our day of dependence upon our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands draws to a close. So this is why, and then the fact that the sermon lecture closes with this claim for the American scholar. This is the American intellectual Declaration of Independence. He's saying, we're going to lift our iron lids. We're sluggish. We're not thinking. We're spending all of our time sort of building. We're focusing on mechanical skills only. We're moving away from combination of intellectual with mechanical skills. We're disregarding thinking. He's upset, right? And as a result, we're relying, in a sense, for our thinking too much on Europe, and we're focusing on these mechanical skills. So he will say in the beginning of the next paragraph, in this hope I accept the topic which not only usage but the nature of our association seem to prescribe to this day, the American scholar. So he wants to figure out what that means, what this could mean. And so he's going to take some time to define what the American scholar is by describing what he, and I'll keep using he, does, or what he is an active soul, as I've said. And what he does is he takes in and he then expresses or puts back out or acts. So activity involves taking in and putting back out. So he opens with a really interesting kind of Marxist, very Marxist actually, but no reason to use that term, description of how man as a whole being on page 57 he says in the third paragraph, beginning of the third paragraph on 57, man is thus metamorphosed into a thing. This is sort of introductory comments. We know that Emerson comes out with his large ideas before he gets into the details of what they mean. So this is kind of amazing. But he says we're a thing, right? So man is we have here. Actually, I'm going to read a few of these parts here. So he's become subdivided. Man has become so minutely subdivided, he says up above, into the pieces of the jobs that he does, right? So that he says the state of society, bottom of the second paragraph on page 57, is one in which the members have suffered amputation from the trunk and struck about so many walking monsters, a good finger, a neck, a stomach, an elbow, but never a man. So a society has been subdivided into these really particular tasks. We've been become specialized and separated and divided according to our the particular tasks that we perform, that we become separated from the trunk in a certain sense. And then the individual man, in completing only that particular task, he says, going back to the third paragraph, man is seldom cheered by any idea of the true dignity of his ministry. He sees his bushel and his cart and nothing beyond. So there's that focus on the bushel, the cart, the mechanical skill, exertion to be performed right there, as he says on 56. Just this focus on the mechanics and for a forgetting of the part that this job plays in some larger society, in some larger whole, right? We see Emerson all the time thinking about this idea of wanting to figure out what one's part is, but also figuring out what one's part is must, for him, have to do or feed very consciously into serving some larger, greater whole. Here, a larger social whole, and also the man himself becoming whole. So he says here, that is to say, always thinking about what he's doing and understanding what his work is and how it participates in something larger. So he sees his bushel and his cart and nothing beyond, and sinks into the farmer instead of man on the farm. So that's a mere farmer looks at the stuff and performs the task, he says, according to Emerson, and has no idea of the true dignity of his ministry, the larger whole. Instead of capitalized man on the farm, a full human being participating in a chosen activity. So there's the difference, and then going down into when he switches then in the next paragraph to discussing what we've done with the thinking man himself, thought has been put into one little category. So he says, in this distribution of functions, right? Functions, tasks, the scholar is the delegated intellect. That's a bad thing. So we say, okay, you're the scholar, you're the thinker, you're the American scholar, you go over there. You go over there and do your little thinking, and that's where thinking happens, and everywhere, that's your function, and other functions occur elsewhere. Well, he hates this. He hates this idea. In the right state, the American scholars capitalize man thinking. So we have man on the farm, man thinking. In the degenerate state, he is a mere thinker, or the parrot of other men's thinking. So he's mocking, actually, the kind of reader and scholar who is, for, as he'll say later on, a mere bookworm. So someone who he describes uses books, likes the books for their own value and not for their value in inspiring us to do something with what we take from them. So that's a really important idea. So we have a bookworm who, in Emerson's view, reads, and does something, doesn't do anything with what he reads because he hasn't actually taken something of it. He hasn't done something with what he read. He hasn't sort of brought the ideas into his own, as he would say, system. He's become a satellite in another system. So he reads the book and he takes, he sort of parrots or takes in the ideas but doesn't really fully process them and doesn't know what to do with them. Versus man thinking, who reads a book, processes the idea, takes in the ideas, does do that part, takes them in, and then does something with them in terms of his own life, his own system. So it's not to say that this man thinking runs around and says whatever he wants at any time. He spends a good part of the time taking in, and then taking in what others have had to say, right? And then processing it, and then deciding what he will do with what that other has said. So he divides this input and output process into, in this lecture, three different sort of moments. So there's Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3 throughout the essay, and Roman numeral 1 is at the bottom of page 57, and we'll go through these briefly. But the three sorts of times in which this input and output happens. And so the first time, he says, in Roman numeral 1, the first in time and the first in importance of the influence upon the mind, well, notice the mind there again, is that of nature. He's starting to talk about what the American scholar is. So we've got here nature, we've got a mind out in nature, and this is what he will call in this section, this is the present tense, right? This is the present tense, and this is the first moment that the mind, or this is the first experience of the mind that the mind has in trying to make sense of the world, out in nature. So not in books, just out in nature looking around, right? And then the next, in Roman numeral 2, this mind looks to not the present any longer, not the mind out in nature where it currently is, but the mind looks to the past, right? So how do we learn about the past? We go to books. So the mind goes to books. And again, goes to the books and will behave when reading, and this is really important, will behave when reading, this active soul, this active mind will behave when reading the same way that it does when out in nature. So keep that in mind, where it's the same process. Then we go to a third moment, or a third sort of arena, and this is when we're in the future. And action is the future. So now this scholar will decide what to do with what he has taken in. And so action is, of course, something that happens, we can't describe the action here because it hasn't happened. Emerson's talking theoretically about what an American scholar, the process the American scholar will follow on the way to action. So I'm actually not going to talk too much about that future action section because actually I find it kind of, what he actually says there sort of is, to me, really confusing. But the idea is that, okay, we take in from nature, we take in from books in the same way, and then we have to do something with what we've taken in. So just to go through a few sections of a few moments in Roman numeral 1, the present nature, and Roman numeral 2, the past books. And again, the active soul is behaving in the same way in each of these sections. So here, first time in nature, bottom of page 57, the mind is influenced by nature, right? So here we have this portrait of this mind looking around, beholding and beholden, he said. The scholar is he of all men whom this spectacle most engages. He must settle its value in his mind. What is nature to him? And here's this active soul, this mind, looking around out into the world, saying and thinking about, you know, what he is taking in. It's kind of similar to the opening of the Divinity School address, in which there's a person out in nature looking around and taking it all in, right? So I'm going to read beginning at the sort of near the top of page 58. So this person is engaging this as a spectacle, looking at around, this active mind. And he says, far too as her splendors shine, system on system shooting like rays, upward, downward, without center, without circumference. In the mass and in the particle, nature hastens to render account of herself to the mind. Nature wants this mind, to understand it. So the mind is taking this in. So classification begins. To the young mind, every living thing is individual and stands by itself. By and by, it finds how to join two things and then see in them one nature, then three, then 3,000, and so tyrannized over by its own unifying instinct. So this is what the mind is doing. Now, a young mind sees, that is to say, an undeveloped or an unsophisticated mind goes out into nature and sees little individual things, sees a flower, sees a frog, sees a tree, and so on, and doesn't grasp that all of these objects, these natural objects that it's viewing, actually are kind of taking part in a larger system. They have their own ecology. They have their own order of organization. So the individual mind just says, look, frog, look, flower, look, pretty, right? And then as the mind thinks and takes in this whole scene and pays attention, starts to see resemblances and parts that these individual pieces play, and starts to see, starts to unify, as the passage says, this unifying instinct. In other words, we're trying to make sense of things, and Emerson believes, and it seems pretty sensible actually, that when we look out into the world, we see pieces, and then we try to see the holes into which these pieces fit, and we kind of go back and forth. And this, for him, is how thinking works. So here he is, unifying instinct. Now it goes further in the paragraph, to say, moving a few lines down, you're classifying, you're trying to figure out where things fit. And he says, but what is classification but the perceiving that these objects are not chaotic, not foreign, they're not random, right? They're organized in some way. And they have a law. Remember the Divinity School addressed this idea of a law, which is also a law of the human mind. So there are laws that pull all of these things together and explain how they work. And the way that our mind is actually sort of following these laws or trying to understand these laws because it takes part in them. And it says at the beginning of the next paragraph, thus to him, to this schoolboy, that idea of someone learning, right, taking in, under the bending dome of day, right, lovely image there, like looking around, taking this in, is suggested that he and it proceed from one root, that he's part of this scene. He's part of the natural scene, right? One is leaf, one is flower, and so on. So we're all a part of this same scene, and the paragraph closes with, thus, right, to know thyself, or to know oneself, right, is the same as to say studying nature. In studying nature and looking at the world and trying to understand how things fit together, you understand also how you, the thinker taking this in, fit into that scene as well. All right, so there's this focus on this input section, right? And then finally understanding where you fit. Now we move to this Roman numeral 2, and Emerson discusses in pretty much the same way how we then go to learn about the past, how the mind is opened up to the past by way of books. So he says the next great influence, same word he used to open Roman numeral 1, influence, nature influence, putting in, right? Next great influence on the spirit of the scholar is the mind of the past, in whatever form, literature, art. Now he's talking largely about, all sorts of things that have been made, but he's going to focus here on books. So he says here in the next paragraph, the scholar of the first age received into him the world around. That would be the scholar out in nature, right? Brooded a paran, gave a new arrangement of his own mind, uttered it again, wrote books about what he thought, right? And that's great. It says it came into him life, it went out from him truth. So he's this scholar in nature has written things, has expressed himself. There's the output, right? Now, what the problem is here, as Emerson will describe in this section, is when we go then, as we ourselves with our own minds, as readers, as thinkers, when we go to these books and we take in and do not have our own insight into the books themselves, the same way we need to have our own insight, as he says on page 58, into nature. We need also to have an insight into books, right? So what we do here then is we do not we don't look to the books for truth, right? We look to the books to take in what they have to tell us, and then we do what we will with them according to what we find in them to be valuable, right? So we have to assess the book's value. So he says, and I'm going to read sort of a longer passage about this. He says, let's see. Well, let's go back to the passage that I opened with a little bit on page 59, last paragraph. Books are the best of things, well used and abused among the worst. What is the right use, right? And you can read the rest of that paragraph that goes to the books and takes out what it needs. So if we go up a little bit further, we'll see, here we go, previous paragraph. Hence, instead of man thinking, we have the bookworm. Hence, the book-learned class, this is the bad way to read, who value books as such, just because they're books, not because they have ideas to communicate to him that he can then adapt and use, but only books as such, not as related to nature and the human constitution. That's really important, right? The book as such, not as related to nature and my own constitution and what I have, right? But as making a sort of third estate with the world and the soul. Hence the restorers of reading, the emendators, the bibliomaniacs of all degrees. So he's upset with people who focus on books as such, that they're valuable just because they're books. The book is a tool, and I think that's the best way to think about this. The book is not, a tool is useless unless you do something with it. And that's probably the clearest way to put what he's really trying to say here, right? So, you have a book, you have a hammer. Well, it can be the most beautiful hammer in the world, but if you just talk about its beauty and admire its beauty and never do anything with it, what good is the hammer? That's sort of what he's saying. So that's why the active soul is the one thing of value in the world. That's what he says in that paragraph at the bottom of page 59. Okay, so just to add a few disclaimers that he gives here, which I want to make clear because I really do think it's inaccurate for, as many do, to take away from this essay the idea that Emerson doesn't think we should ever read carefully. I think you can argue with that, but I think that's a little sloppy. So he comes in with some disclaimers. He's very interested. We have to have the input part. We have to take in. But he adds to this also this disclaimer that top of page 60, sort of near the top, the second paragraph that begins undoubtedly. All right, so there's a right way of reading. He wants us to read rightly, but man thinking must not be subdued by his instruments, right? So the tools are to be used and so on. But here he says, books are for the scholar's idle times. When he can read God directly, the hour is too precious to be wasted in other men's transcripts of their readings. So a transcript is literally the writing down of what one thinks, right, or what was said. So you don't need books at all when you're able to have insight directly into nature. That sounds very much like Emerson, doesn't it? And that's a nice idea. The point here, though, that he's also making is that we rarely are able to have these insights. Insights are hard to come by. So therefore, we need books for our idle times, for when we're not able to see directly into nature. We're not able to have an insight into how everything hangs together, what these laws are, these sort of moment of intuitive insight, as he calls it, right? Fuzzy, I realize, but the best way to describe that is just when you have a moment and things seem to make sense, right? And how often do we have those? I would say probably not terribly often in any sort of large way, right? So that's what he's saying. So we need books. Books keep us busy and they keep us occupied when we don't have direct insight on our own. Then also, he says here, this is really important too, at the top of page 61, that full paragraph that begins, of course, and you can look through this later. You know, he doesn't say, therefore, that we all don't need to read much, we don't need to have foundational knowledge, that the kind that we can get from books, and that sometimes we can only get from books. We can't go everywhere in the world, we can't go into the past. We need the knowledge that books can often provide. So it's just kind of makes it's common sense if you think about it. So that is not to say that all knowledge is gained from books. That's not what he's saying at all. But there is a kind of knowledge that can only be gained from books, and we need that knowledge. And so he wants us to be. He says here there is a portion on page 61, about 4 or 5 lines down from the top. There is a portion of reading quite indispensable to a wise man. History and exact science he must learn by laborious reading, and there's no way around it, right? So you don't become a nurse by simply doing a lot of hands-on stuff. There's a lot you have to read and have to just kind of know and memorize and work with. There's a lot of laborious reading, and then there's a lot more to it than that, but that is indispensable, right? So I just wanted to point that out. So just a few more minutes to this lecture. I want to go to the conclusions, to the application section that begin on page 63. So what do we do with this? So the American scholar, who would be, for him, the best kind of actual professional thinker or professor or writer and so on, but also for him, the best kind of, thinker out in the world. All of us can think this way. Here's what he should. We would all like to think like this American scholar, but the professional American scholar should behave this way. On page 63, he says, now in the middle of the page, after that space break, says here, and he was talking now about the duties of this American scholar. They are such as become man thinking. They're such that are appropriate to him. They may all be comprised in self-trust. We've heard that before. The office of the scholar is to cheer. This is what he's supposed to do. Cheer, raise, guide men by showing them facts amidst appearances. So by trying to help others to see the truth through the garbage, basically, right? So not to be deceived by performances, by mere performances, that is, right? Because we're out in the world, we're performing, we're acting, we see things. So he's not saying that, everything that we see is necessarily false. It's that we need to be able to judge the true from the false, and to understand when something is, what the facts are amidst all of the, appearances that can trick us. So this is his duty to help us to do that. And he does that because he's taken many, he says he plies the slow, unhonored, and unpaid task of observation. He's allowed to do this, or he's actually able to do this because he has spent so much time observing and taking in and trying to distinguish truth from fiction. So this is, you can, take issue with this and so on, but this is the claim here. So, and he says again at the bottom of 64, so that's what the scholar's job is. Bottom of 64, beginning of that last paragraph, he says something about what the attitude of the scholar should be, right? So he says, free should the scholar be. We've seen this all over Emerson, free. Now, not free to be me, free to say whatever I want, but free as in here, brave, free and brave, right? Free even to the definition of freedom without any hindrance that does not arise out of his own constitution. So he will determine on his own what he has to say, right? And that doesn't mean that he spews, he just I gotta be me and he's gonna say whatever. It means that he has taken the time, has observed the world, is free to examine, right? He's actually free to do that, and it's his right to go out and examine for himself directly. We've seen that throughout Emerson and throughout this essay. Go to the stuff yourself. Go to nature yourself. Go to books yourself, right? And take freely, right? That is to say, liberally. You do it. You go in there and do it, and then you decide what to do with what you've learned according to your own constitution, according to how what you read or what you take in this essay has to do with the living of your own life and how you see yourself fitting into a larger whole. What's your part to play? And this recalls the beginning of the lecture, right? What's your part to play? How does it fit into a larger system of laws, into the larger workings of the society, into the larger movement of your own life, right? So, and really practically, when you think about this totally makes sense. I mean, we need to learn particular things. We need to, we gather skills along the way, and we try to figure out what exactly to do with them. And we can't all exactly do the same things with them. And nor should we, right? I mean, we have to figure out our best way to integrate everything we've learned into our whole being, our whole person, in order to do the best we can to play our part in a larger society, in a larger whole, in the larger movement of our lives. So that's his real point here. Again, we see the active soul and so on. He'll say now, page 66, the beginning of the 3-line paragraph in the middle of the page, again after a space break, he says, and I've already read this line, but he's dwelt too much on the sort of ideal, this is my ideal, this is how the scholar should be. Now, what should he actually do right here and now? What does this American scholar actually do? And I'm going to read part of this quite famous and really kind of beautiful passage. It's on page 67. So this was really known, this paragraph particularly begins, one of these signs is the fact, and I won't read the whole thing. I'll actually probably just read a couple of lines, but this paragraph is so famous in Emerson for describing, or it's known to describe, how the American scholar approaches the world, or where he or she begins, that's different from, presumably different from, what European thinkers and writers do. So here's what the American scholar will do. He will, and I keep saying he, but default, he will, fourth line down in that paragraph that begins one of these signs on 67, instead of the sublime and the beautiful, the near, the low, the common was explored and poetized. The American scholar is going to go for the low, for the common. Move down a bit in the paragraph. He says, I ask not for the great, the remote, the romantic. All of these things that are far away. All of these things that have nothing to do with his immediate experience of his own life, right? What is doing in Italy or Arabia, what is Greek art or Provençal minstrelsy, I embrace, this is a great, really frequently quoted passage, I embrace the common. I explore and sit at the feet of the familiar, the low. Give me insight into today, there's Emerson's language, insight again into today, into right here, into where I am with my mind thinking. And you may have the antique and future worlds. You can have the past and the future and everything else. You can have the remote. You can have everything that's not right here with me. All right, so what would we really know? The meal in the firkin, the milk in the pan, the ballad in the street, the news of the boat, the glance of the eye, the form and gait of the body. Show me the ultimate reason of these matters. Show me the sublime presence of the highest spiritual cause lurking, as it always does lurk, in these suburbs and extremities of nature. He wants to focus on the small, the common, the low, what is right in front of him, in order to figure out how the universe works, how nature works, how this great existence in which we find ourselves just all comes together. We don't need to go far away. We can do it right here. And that's the big claim for the American scholar. And that actually, I have to tell you, kind of gives me a little sort of goosebumps, because there is this sense in which he's really responding to people in a time who really thought that the only thing worth knowing was European, and that we had nothing to say here. And this was really a call to arms, so to speak, a call to literary arms, and a call to paying attention to what we have right here, right in front of us. What's the good that this nation can give to the world, and the bad, right? But what do we see right here? Okay, so that's the end of that, and we're going to see similar themes again in self-reliance, the next essay that we'll be studying.